It's pivotal for emerging biotechs to secure sophisticated investors, partners, and expert consultants to bring their therapies to market. In this excerpt from a webinar given by Dr. Fran Brown, Senior Vice President at Certara, she explains how the asset evaluation process looks at a drug program's risk mitigation, and probability of success.
Some practical advice. Most due diligence now are conducted through virtual data rooms. The advantages of this is people don't need to travel. It allows a very sophisticated control over data access with regard to the ability to cut and paste and download. And one advantage from the company that is going through the due diligence is that once these data rooms are set up, there's very little onward maintenance needed, and that they can be there and ready to cover multiple discussions with multiple potential partners. What I will say, from having done a lot of reviews of a lot of different data rooms, from the point of a reviewer, please create a logical structure for your data room. Err on the side of including information and documents rather than exclusion. If there's documents that are missing, then there's a time factor involved in then requesting the addition of those documents to the data room, and all of which can have a delaying factor on progressing a deal. Very useful is to have a naming convention for files so people can understand very quickly where to look for the information they're seeking. Tables of contents are also very, very useful, and most of these virtual data rooms will produce those automatically, but then they only make sense if there's a naming convention in place to start with. Please consider file access restrictions carefully. For publicly available information, it can be very frustrating to not be able to download or print it. While those restrictions are very understandable for things that are sensitive and confidential, if things are in a public domain, then it just creates a very negative feeling for a reviewer to have to go through the process of finding it publicly to be able to print it. Some advice on handling questions. Please avoid the one-word answer. The idea of due diligence is to be able to convey information and an understanding of the program. And if you're asked a question, it's because they're looking for additional information. So providing a fuller response rather than a very short one is actually much more beneficial, because the only thing that will happen is they'll ask a question again in a different way. No data room is complete. No development program is without gaps. They exist in all programs. Just acknowledge them. They're not a negative. They're certainly not a negative when they're known about and acknowledged. Where possible, support any written responses with discussions with the team itself. The team discussions have multiple benefits in that they convey your level of competence and strategic awareness to the team, and they can provide so much more than a written answer. So if you're offered that opportunity, take it, because it's very valuable. Show that you have been able to consider the impact of missing information on risk. You might know that if something hasn't been performed, you know that it should be performed, and you've marked when you will perform it. All of that conveys an acknowledgement of skill and competence and the ability to move a program forward. So what does due diligence focus on? So it's got actually, I've put two of the aspects on here, but I'm going to include a third one as we talk through this. So it looks not just at the data, although the data is a very focal part in understanding risk. It also looks at the strategy. And what do we mean by strategy? In essence, there's kind of two elements to that. There's the target product profile, which is where do I want to be? And I've got a slide later that will talk about the elements of the target product profile itself. But it's based around an understanding of what you need this compound to be once it reaches the market. And included in that is an understanding of geography. So are you looking only at a US market? Are you looking at US and Europe? Do you bring Japan into that? What are the major players? Because all of this affects whether your strategic approach is going to be correct or not. And then the other part of the strategy is a detailed development plan. In other words, how do I get to where I want to go? Is it realistic? Are the timelines realistic? Are the costs realistic? Are there stage gate investment decisions included? Have you pushed CMC development in order to not make that investment until you see your phase 2A data? All of these show sort of a very strategic approach to the development process while not delaying things to the last minute where the risk becomes greater. What do you know about the risks of your program? Has there been a formal risk assessment? Is there a formal risk mitigation strategy in place? And will the whole program as itself deliver the data that will allow you to meet your target product profile in the first place? The third element that is included in this is about agreements. What we see in due diligence is a increasing number of acquisitions, compounds that have been purchased from previous companies so that they are coming with a legacy amount of data. And these can be actually one previous acquisition, they can be multiple acquisitions. They can be situations where the rights have been purchased for a certain geography, but the development in other geographies is still continuing by the original owner. So in these kind of situations, agreements become very important. Understanding what is the agreement with the previous owner for the data. Have you acquired all of the raw data sets as well as the study reports? Do you have a safety agreement in place to report global safety worldwide if you have a geographical partner? So understanding the agreement terms and what is in place is another level of risk when compounds are coming from a previous acquirer. So that was a little bit about the due diligence process. The second half of this presentation is actually focused on a look back through the last 2 years that we did. And we thought it would be very, very interesting to understand why it was that investors don't proceed to a deal. So we took a look back over the last 2 years and we looked at 20 of the due diligence assessments that we have done in that period. Only 3 of these went to deal completion. Those were not always because of the findings of due diligence. Some of the reasons that they didn't go through were related to the fact that they couldn't reach an understanding on the deal terms. There was just 2 different perspectives that could not be reconciled. But these due diligence assessments, they cover a range of diverse therapeutic areas. They were different types of programs. Some of them were NCE, some of them were line extensions, some of them were complex generics. They were a mixture of small molecules, biologics, vaccines, cell therapies. And they were a mixture of deal types. So a very, very heterogeneous set of projects. But when we look back, there were some learnings that we think were very important. And I want to go through some of these today. And it's about the reasons investors decided not to invest. And I don't need you to read through all of these, but the take home in this one is that the reasons can be one really major one that's a deal breaker. And you see on there we have wrong molecule. In other words, the intrinsic properties of the molecule could never achieve what it needed to achieve. But there are circumstances where what you what you see is accumulation of a lot of small issues to a point where it becomes affecting the whole probability of success and the probability of moving forward. So some of the reasons that investments didn't move forward, you will be expecting. Some of them were a surprise for us. So the first reason, differentiation. In other words, the target product profile was not going to deliver something that was commercially viable. And the reality is that good science and medical need aren't enough to make a drug that is commercially viable. So, and the reason that people develop a TPP in the first place, it defines the lowest threshold for success. In other words, if your compound cannot meet what you define here, it is just not a viable thing to continue forward with. And the TPP, in essence, is what drives the commercial forecast. So starting at the left-hand side, so the primary elements that go into a TPP, what is the target indication? And it's good to get down to a precise wording of that indication. Which patients are you looking to treat? Is it going to be given alone or in combination? Clinical positioning, is it going to be a first-line treatment? What's the current treatment paradigm? Does that paradigm vary by geography? And if it is, then you have to separate out and you have to think about that treatment paradigms by geography. Where does your compound fit into the current treatment paradigm? Who are you looking to take market share from? What is the length of therapy and the dosing? Do you need to have an oral therapy, or are you looking for IV? If all of your competition is going once daily, then you're probably onto a losing streak if you're considering that 3 times daily is going to be viable. What's the treatment duration? And all of these then feed into a definition of what efficacy you need to see in your clinical programs to be able to meet that indication and that clinical positioning, all of which is driving the differentiation in the market. So on an efficacy side, what are the primary efficacy parameters that are required for registration? And these may not be the ones that are most useful to drive usage in the marketplace. There's a very delicate balance between what's needed for approval and what's needed to be competitive. And that leads a lot of people to put in a balance of primary efficacy parameters that are focused on registration, but secondary parameters that are focused on the commercialization. Safety, defining what success looks like for safety is a little more difficult because you don't know what safety issues are going to come up. But if there are key compounds that you are trying to improve on, if safety of standard therapy is an issue, then knowing how you're going to improve on that is an important part of your target product profile. And all of these drive the assessment of the commercial value, understanding the drivers in the market, knowing where you plan to take market share from, and where you sit in the treatment algorithm. All of these will help support the arguments you make on commercial value. A part and parcel of that commercial assessment is also the understanding of when you expect to launch and what kind of period of exclusivity that gives you in relationship to your IP. So we had quite a few examples of compounds that did not deliver expected commercial value. They were either compounds that might have made it to registration. So we did have an example of something that would have achieved, based on the data that we saw, would have achieved registration. But due to the dynamics of the market and the positioning it was aiming for, it would never have returned investment. So in the commercial and forecasting side, what's looked at in the due diligence is again, geographical ambitions. Are we looking at a forecast for one country, for multiple countries? Understanding the epidemiology and therapeutic dynamics. Who's out there to compete, and how do you differentiate against the existing therapy, but also against therapies that are more advanced in development? What clinical value do you expect to provide? What is the benefit for the patient? How do you justify that with a cost effectiveness and market access arguments? What are your pricing approaches and expectation on market share? So all of these things are things that the commercial due diligence assessment will look at. And they might not agree with the assessment. They may come up with something that's more conservative, but understanding the logic behind the generation of your forecast is very important for them. So one big thing that came out in many of the due diligences the factor was the CMC development. And CMC covers a huge range of activities, covering the production of both the drug substance and the drug product, all of the analytical method development. But on top of all of that, it also covers the commercial supply chain and how much of that is in place and what are the plans and strategies to ensure that. So it covers a lot of things, both from science and analytics right through to commercial agreements, audit history for your suppliers, and essentially the cost of goods. And there was many instances that we saw where a lot of the CMC development had been delayed, so that in essence it was running behind the clinical program and it was playing catch up. And the problem with doing that is that you leave a lot of risk sitting on the table to a point where you can actually no longer mitigate it. One of the ones you are expecting is efficacy, the benefit risk of the compound. In these areas, we were looking sort of from a clinical and statistics point of view. There were compounds where no adequate dose ranging had been performed. Companies had gone into a phase 2B study on the basis of data in 4 or 5 patients. That creates an element of risk and uncertainty. The size, quality, and endpoints for studies are important things that we look at. And also the type of patients and how they relate to the target product profile and the ultimate ambitions of where you want to be. From a clinical pharmacology perspective, in this kind of assessment, we're looking at is the exposure efficacy and exposure safety relationships, are they well understood? Is there separation between doses which efficacy is seen at and doses at which there's got to be safety issues? Always you have to think about the extrapolation of those to a population that becomes more and more variable as you go through development, and you loosen your entry criteria on clinical programs. Diagnostic. This is sort of an emerging field within due diligence, that more and more companies are trying to develop personalized medicine, individualized therapy. The corollary of that is that you need to pay as much attention to the development of the proposed diagnostic as you do to the development of the compound itself, especially when you're looking at a companion diagnostic. From a regulatory perspective, the diagnostic needs to be validated before you go into phase 3 studies where you're using it. And in many of the cases that we were looking at, what had happened was a retrospective analysis of phase 2 had identified a subset of patients where a diagnostic showed that there may be a beneficial treatment response in this subset of patients. And then that was then extrapolated to phase 3, but it was not being done with a commercially available diagnostic. And at that point, there needs to be a validation agreement in place with the CDRH in the US, if that's the way that you're going. And that can take time. And introducing a phase 3 program before that validation has occurred increases the risk that this patient population, subpopulation, may not be accepted. So there's a real high dependency between a clinical program and a diagnostic development and validation that needs to be considered very early in development if you go this route. One of the surprising things that came up from our point of view, actually far too often, was that one of the major reasons that investments weren't pursued was that companies had failed to take advice of regulatory input that they had been given. And this occurred when regulators give advice, they don't do it lightly, and there isn't a mandate that says you need to follow everything you've been told, but the consequences of not following it need to be considered. So from a regulatory perspective, one of the key things that we look at from a due diligence is what has been the interactions with all the regulatory agencies. Again, geographies are a key point. Are we looking only to develop in one area or multiple areas? What was the outcomes of all of those discussions? What advice has been given, and how has that advice been integrated in the onward development plans for the agent? And one key thing actually is a company taking advantage of the regulatory advice it could do? So some companies do this very, very well. They are interacting with agencies, they are getting all of the advice they can. And then there are others which have not obtained any advice and just hope that they get to the end of phase 2 and everything will be accepted. So the access to regulatory advice can be a huge benefit to a program. The other part of the regulatory side is with regard mostly to the design of the pivotal studies. And there it becomes very detailed. How does the patient selection for those studies compare with the planned label and the target product profile? What kind of comparators are being chosen? And that is often an interplay between what might be the best commercial comparator but with what might be the best registration comparator. What are the efficacy endpoints? What's the expected treatment effect that's been used to generate the sample size? What's the dropout rate? What's the way that missing data is going to be handled? And all of these very detailed things become very important when you start looking at pivotal studies for registration.